And finally, we get to the last tier. The amazing tier is reserved for what I consider to be the best of the best. All of these fights are what I believe makes FromSoft games as special as they are. While some of the fights in previous tiers might have been carried by other things outside of the specific mechanics of the fights, all of the fights from here on out are fantastic in both presentation and gameplay. It also coincidentally ended up having 10 fights in it, so I guess this is also my top 10 FromSoft fights. But I want to keep this video under 5 hours long, so let's get into it. Starting with fast disclaimer, I'm just going to refer to this whole boss fight as Demon Prince for simplicity's sake. And we finally get to what I consider to be the best duo fight that FromSoft has done so far. Though some might be a bit hesitant to call this a duo fight because it's only the first phase that has 2 enemies, though I would argue that this is a major factor as to why this is such a good boss. But first, let's break down why I think the first phase works so well. So the way the first phase works is that there are 2 bosses. For most of the phase, only one of the bosses are going to be active, while the other one will be cooling down. The active one will actively be running you down, mainly using melee attacks, while the other one will be keeping his distance and occasionally shooting projectiles. This is such a simple system of making a duo boss that I'm surprised that FromSoft hasn't really done it before. And no, I'm not counting the double dragon biters from Dark Souls 2. Another really important part of this fight that makes it work is that they added a new way of doing projectile attacks. Usually, when a projectile is fired, there isn't any indication outside of you literally seeing the object flying towards you. But with this fight, they added an indicator for its path. This makes it so you only really need to focus on the active one chasing you down, while still being able to keep track of the other boss's attacks. This coupled with the active one having a good moveset that manages to be aggressive while still leaving plenty of openings for counterattacks, you have a kind of simple but extremely fun duo fight. I do have some minor problems with it, such as the passive boss sometimes making his way up to melee range and swinging at you. This instantly makes the fight a mess, but it's pretty rare. The first phase is also fairly easy as neither of them have all that much HP, and they leave big openings for damage when they power up and down. That being said, I do feel as though this is intentional as the second phase is pretty challenging on its own. Once you kill both demons in phase 1, the second demon you kill will then transform into the prince. The order in which you kill the first phase actually changes the moveset the second phase has, which is a pretty interesting mechanic. This does come with some drawbacks, as one of the versions is a fair bit easier than the other. Though I suppose you could argue this is a good thing, as the players can learn this and target to kill them in a specific order. Either way, whichever one you kill last will grow to many times its size and get a much larger HP bar. Mechanics wise, the fight isn't all that different from the first phase. Moveset wise, the Demon Prince is pretty similar to the active demon in phase 1, though much larger and a bunch of new moves of course. He feels pretty good to fight for being a bigger boss. I find that a lot of larger bosses have a tendency to become a bit messy, but the Demon Prince does a pretty good job of being readable, and keeping his distance so you get to see what he's doing. Depending on which demon you killed in the first phase, he will have different special moves. He will either spawn a bunch of orbs that he'll throw at you, or he'll shoot a massive laser. First, the orb attack is pretty bullshit and it's generally suggested that you avoid going against it. It's way too hard to dodge and the fight devolves into a bit of a shitfest whenever he uses it. The laser attack on the other hand is way easier to handle. Most of the time you can just run up to him without having to deal with it at all, leaving you with plenty of time to lay into him. At first I used to not like this choice and I thought that you should balance them, but I like the fact that you can learn which is easier to deal with and deliberately get it every time. If it were a random mechanic you had no control over, then I would hate it, but since you can choose, I think it's a pretty decent mechanic. Also, if you think the fight is too easy and you're a masochist, you can actually choose the harder one, so there's that. I don't really have that much to say presentation or lore wise. There isn't really all that much easily accessible lore about this boss in the game, so it doesn't get that much of a boost from that, such as fights like Twin Princes and Radon. I do like the presentation a lot though. The fact that you entered the fight by taking a massive plunge into the arena is unique and cool. The bosses themselves are pretty distinct looking, even when it comes to other bosses in the series. This is especially impressive when you consider the fact that once you take a closer look at them, they're actually quite reminiscent of the Messengers of God, the weird looking white demon things that fly down Alondo in Dark Souls 1. That's about it for what I have to say about this boss. Overall, it's a fairly simple boss when you break it down, yet somehow manages to be what most other duo fights couldn't. Good. I'm not sure how they managed to make such a banger of a duo fight in Dark Souls 3 and then completely fuck up every duo boss in Elden Ring. It's like they completely forgot they even made the Demon Prince and just went back to slapping 2 random enemies into the same arena and calling it a day. I really hope they decide to design more duo fights like the Demon Prince and Gargoyles instead of continuing to make bosses like Godskin Duo.
Only an honest death will kill you now. simplicity.
Lady Maria is one of the most memorable characters in the entire game, despite this fight being the only time you actually get to meet her. You hear so much about Lady Maria throughout the game, from both item descriptions and NPC dialogue. She's built up to be this pinnacle of a hunter, and you get to make all sorts of theories in your head about who this character might be. And then finally in the DLC, you get to meet her and she does not disappoint. Her cutscene, her design, her arena, all iconic. After having played the DLC, Lady Maria was instantly my favorite character FromSoft has ever made. And this was kept up until the release of Elden Ring, where she was finally dethroned by someone a bit higher on the list. Also, the realization that the doll was modeled after Lady Maria is still one of my most memorable experiences I've ever had in a FromSoft game. All this is just further expanded upon when you get to her actual fight. Her moveset does a fantastic job at making you feel like you're fighting against another hunter. The only fight that does this better being Gehrman. This mostly comes from the fact that once you hit a certain HP threshold, Lady Maria will buff her attacks with blood and then fire. I think this is overall a worthy trade-off, as it makes Maria overall a much harder fight, ultimately making her the better fight. With a more complex moveset and simply more mechanics, she gives you a challenge that Gehrman simply couldn't with his simpler moveset. I do very much like both fights for these two different reasons, but overall I think Lady Maria is the better fight because of it. Though I do run into the problem I talked about briefly about in the last tier when talking about Maria. There just isn't anything about her moveset that stands out, making it hard to really talk about it in more depth. All of her attacks are fantastic, and when put together you get what I would almost call a perfect moveset. The only thing that puts her below the rest of the bosses on the list are difficulty and complexity. While she achieves a flow of combat that not a lot of bosses manage, Maria has just been outdone by newer bosses that have minute differences in how fun I find them. That being said, she is a blast to fight, made even better by her lore and presentation. If I had to muster up some criticism for her, it's that she, despite what I said about her being harder than Gehrman, she still isn't all that hard. Even in my first time, it didn't take me all that long to beat her. And this was without exploiting the fact that she basically has zero poise. She is definitely one of my favorite fights, who over time has simply been pushed down by newer fights. But she'll always stay a core gaming memory for me. Gameplay wise, Isshin is what I would consider to be my favorite final boss in any of the FromSoft games, not counting any of the DLC bosses. A lot of this comes from Isshin being the only final boss that I actually think is really difficult. Counting total time spent on any boss, Isshin was easily my number one until Elden Ring was released, when a certain someone showed up and destroyed that record, but we'll get to her in a bit. I'm honestly not sure if this was the average experience with Isshin, but man, it took me a while. Despite this, I never found him to be unfair in any way. Every time I died, I could acknowledge that this was purely my own fault. Well, instead of speaking so broadly, let's get into a bit more depth. Isshin is a very long fight, with 4 main phases. The first phase is another showdown with Genichiro. Instead of feeling a bit tiring seeing how this is technically a third fight against him, I really like this design decision. First, it's a nice way of showing the player the progression of their skills throughout the game. At the start of the game, you get a baseline. Most likely you get your ass beat and Genichiro cuts up your arm. Next, you get to meet him a bit into the game, after you get more comfortable with the game mechanics, and after a struggle, you finally beat him. And then finally, you get to meet him at the end of the game, when you have finally mastered the game and it feels like a reverse of the start of the game, where you'll most likely stomp him in the arena he cut off your arm many hours ago. Gameplay wise, Genichiro here isn't really all that different to what he was like the last time you fought him. This makes sense in both narrative sense and gameplay, as this plays into what I said earlier about showing you how much you've progressed. Making him pushover was also necessary, as he is only the first of 4 phases in this boss fight. After having dealt with Genichiro, we finally get to the actual fight, as we get to see Isshin quite literally crawl out of Genichiro's neck. The second phase of the fight is just a normal duel against Isshin. For Isshin's first phase, he's pretty standard. He will for the most part only use his sword, making him somewhat similar to Genichiro in that sense. He does utilize most of the mechanics in the game, such as Mikiri counters and attacks you have to jump over. I'm just going to say this now so I won't have to repeat myself later, but throughout all of Isshin's phases, he never has any problematic attacks. Overall, his moveset is well done, having a nice mix between faster and slower attacks, while still managing to make him the hardest fight in the game. As we get to phase 3 is where I feel like Isshin really comes into his own. When you enter phase 3, Isshin will pull out a giant spear that he will use alongside his sword. This spear is what mostly makes this fight what it is in my head, as once he gets his spear, he immediately feels more unique. Instead of being yet another humanoid with a sword, he now has a mix between both sword attacks and spear attacks. Overall, this has several effects on the fight. First, changing the way you have to play around him. By increasing his range, it makes so you can't just play right outside of his sword range anymore. Either you have to fully engage him in close combat, parrying most of his attacks, or you have to play more of a style where you dip in and out to get attacks on him. Phase 4 is honestly more of the same. The only thing that really changes in this phase is that he'll throw in some lightning attacks. Sadly, I don't think this really adds anything to the fight. The only thing it really achieves is making it easier. The hardest thing about the lightning mechanic is knowing that it exists, as hitting it back to him is really easy and does a pretty substantial amount of damage. This makes it so as long as you get comfortable with this phase 3 and you beat it, you will most likely be able to clear the fight in a try or two. I don't really have a problem with this as the fight is already pretty long and challenging. If they had made the last phase even harder, I think the fight would have been too challenging and overall making it worse. If I were to have any criticism on this fight, is that it's a bit too easy to abuse. Same with some past fights in the game, there isn't really anything stopping you from just sprinting around the arena, occasionally going in for a hit. This way you don't actively have to dodge anything while still whittling him down. This doesn't really change my opinion on the fight since I don't do this, but I guess it could be seen as poor design that it's possible at all. All in all, Isshin is a pretty fantastic fight that manages to constantly change throughout its duration, while never feeling overly complicated or losing its identity. Isshin really makes me hope that FromSoft will continue making their final fights more of a challenge instead of having them be on the easier side, as with most of their older games. Elden Ring does make me a bit more hopeful that this is true, but it will have to wait and see as to release more games.
Upon my name as Godfrey, the first Elden Lord.
Godfrey is a beast. He's easily one of the most likable characters in the entirety of Elden Ring. He's another great example of a fight where the game does a fantastic job of building him up before his fight with the use of item descriptions, NPC dialogue and cutscenes. This is further expanded upon when you finally get to face him yourself. At first, this was a shock to me. I did not think I was going to get to face him. I thought at best he was going to be some important lore character that we don't get to see until the DLC, like with Artorias or Lady Maria. And when you do get to fight him, he matches up perfectly with the image you have built of him. In his first phase, he's a blast to fight, with a versatile moveset that takes in use fast attacks, slow attacks, and attacks you have to jump over, and blend them together in such a way that gives the fight a fantastic flow. There is barely any downtime, as when you aren't actively attacking or dodging, you'll still be positioning, even if you aren't just healing after getting the shit beat out of you. I truly don't have any complaints about its first phase, and it only gets better in phase 2. Once you get Godfrey to half health, it plays a cutscene. His transition from Godfrey to Hoarah is pure hype, completely tearing up his clothes and covering himself in blood, really giving you the sense that this is truly the chieftain of the Badlands. This comes with a pretty significant change to his gameplay. Instead of using a battle axe and being somewhat slow, he instead switches to purely using his fist. With this, he also becomes a lot more aggressive and in your face. In this phase, basically half of his moves become grab attacks as his combat style changes to that of a grappler. This fits really well with his image as the chieftain of the Badlands and makes his second phase feel completely unique compared to any other boss in the series. But the most important part of either of these phases is how it makes you feel, not specifically what you're doing. Despite both phases being completely different in terms of how you approach them, they both do a fantastic job of making you just feel cool. I think this is extremely important when you consider who you are fighting. Godfrey is not a character that cares much about all the politics that's going around you and that most characters will talk about. He has no ill will towards you when you defeat him. If anything, he's happy to have been defeated by what you consider to be a superior fighter. This fight just elevates just how much of a cool dude Godfrey really is, and because of this I think it makes the fight a lot more enjoyable. I find that presentation is a pretty major factor as to how much I enjoy a fight, and Godfrey is one of the best at this. Hoarah also easily has some of the coolest looking attacks in the entire game. It is honestly just a blast to get grabbed by this man. Champion Gundyr is probably the best example of what I would call a duel fight in the series. Of course, I don't mean this as just a one-on-one, but duel fights are more the type of fights where I feel like even in lore, the fight is completely even. There aren't any special circumstances like magic or additional people, just a straight one-on-one where you're both using the tools that you have on you. It's pretty much the same as what I was talking about with Gurman, though I do think Gundyr does it better. To start with, and this is more important to me than I feel like it is with most people, but Gundyr just looks cool. And I'm not really referring to his appearance, though he isn't a lame looking boss. I'm more referring to the way he fights. He's one of the rare bosses where his fighting style feels grounded and realistic. Compared to the real world, the way he fights isn't all that realistic, but in the Dark Souls universe, it does. He doesn't have any excessively over the top moves, he mostly just fights with his halberd and his own limbs. It's a pretty huge plus for me as I love unarmed combat. I think it just looks really cool. Gundyr does have some specific moves that looks especially cool, like his attack where he throws you in the air and kicks you away, but I'm focused on the overall feel of his moveset. After Gundyr, and even more so after Hoaraloo, I really hope that FromSoft makes a boss in the future that exclusively does unarmed combat. Gundyr is another one of those bosses where I honestly don't even have that much to say, despite being one of my favorites. Much like Commander Nile, this is just one of those fights that I, for a lack of a better word, really like the vibe of. He does stick out with his placement as he isn't as complex or important as the bosses around him, I just happen to really like him. A lot of the reason why I do enjoy him so much is just the overall feel of the fight, and most of that comes from what I have already said. Gameplay wise, there isn't much for me to say. He doesn't really have any problematic moves. The only one I can really think of is the attack where he charges at you with his halberd. This move can be a bit awkward to dodge depending on where you're standing compared to the boss, but even then it just becomes a problem of your positioning and not the attack being bad. So overall, I rate this fight high for the flow it has, paired with its presentation. And honestly, if you have fought this fight yourself, I think you know exactly what I mean. These last 4 fights were by far the hardest to rate. The difference in my personal opinion of them is minuscule, and I went back and forth on their positions, so honestly, by the time this comes out, I might have changed my mind on a couple of them. But eventually, I just decided to lock them in place so I could actually write this last bit. So unfortunately, the boss that came up last out of these 4 was Gael. Obviously, this isn't to say that Gael is a weak fight in any way. If anything, I think Gael is probably one of the most visually stunning fights in any of the Dark Souls games. What it ultimately came down to was a mix of minor problems and things out of his control, like who he is and what game he's in, but let's get a bit more specific. His face mode is very simple. He doesn't have anything that is particularly hard to dodge, and honestly overall acts like what Gundyr was to the Isshin fight. I do like the presentation of it though. The arena, coupled with his more animalistic behavior, does have interesting lore implications, making it a bit more interesting. Where the fight really gets started is in his phase 2. When he does get into his phase 2, he gets a cutscene, which I'm normally not too big of a fan of when it comes to harder fights like Gael. I much prefer it in the fights so you'll beat in like 1 or 2 tries. But this obviously isn't a major problem. Other than this, phase 2 is a pretty fantastic fight. There are a lot of things I specifically like about this fight that aren't done that much in other ones. One such thing is his cape. Not only is it really cool looking, but it's also very clever gameplay wise. Normally, when bosses get effects that extend their range, that is all that it does, so it isn't all that hard to play around, and you usually don't really even have to change the way you approach the fight. But with Gael, not only does it extend his range, but there is also a slight delay to the attack. This makes it so that you not only have to consider the range of the attack, but also the timing and direction you roll in. If you roll how you would normally dodge his sword swings, then you will most likely get hit by the lingering cape effect. So you have to either dodge extremely late, fitting into the very tight window where you have iframes for both his sword and cape, or you have to roll in such a way that you don't get hit by the cape at all. This adds a lot of complexity to the fight when compared to other humanoids with swords, and is probably my favorite mechanic of the fight, but there are still several others that I want to talk about. One such mechanic is his use of several types of attacks. While I might have just complimented Gundyr for his lack of variety, Gael does the opposite and does it extremely well. Not only does Gael have his sword and cape, but he also has a miracle, a crossbow, and even summoning signs. I'll be starting with the miracle as I think this is the worst part of his face. On its own, it's not that bad. All he does is throw out 3 to 5 rings in front of him that will return after a certain delay. The problem comes with the fact that more often than not, it will just clip into the ground, make it so that you can't see them at all. This makes it so you just have to completely avoid where they are, instead of actively trying to dodge them. Obviously, this isn't a major issue, but it's just something I noticed while fighting him. His crossbow attacks are a lot better, though I do still have some issues with them. He has several attacks where he'll use his crossbow, all of which are completely fine when viewed from the viewpoint of dodging them. The problem comes from how he uses it. Usually, you would think that an enemy using a ranged attack when you're close would be beneficial to you, but not with Gael, as when he pulls out his crossbow, you can't really get in any counterattacks. For the most part, you just have to play safe and wait for this attack to end, even if you are really close to him. This isn't really much of a problem, as most of the time he uses his crossbow, it's either to create distance or during an attack where he's unable to get hit anyways. One pretty big plus with the crossbow is that it's a pretty sick weapon. It's a completely unique weapon to Gael, as it's a special repeating crossbow. This, coupled with the fact that most of his attack where he uses it, looks great, and it becomes one of the most memorable parts of the fight. Lastly, and this one is more of a cool interaction than anything, but Gael actually has a teleport attack where he will summon himself with a summoning sign to attack you. The attack itself isn't really that interesting, it's more the fact that he uses something that is an established game mechanic that NPCs never actually interact with against you that is interesting. It does kinda leave me wishing they used more stuff like this during the fight, but it's still a very interesting mechanic. Phase 3 is where most of my actual problems with the fight come in. In Phase 3, he will stop using several of his attacks from Phase 2 and replace them with attacks that I'm not really a fan of. The two most prominent ones are an attack where he summons lightning strikes, and the other one is where he spawns several flying skulls. The former one is the one I have the least problems with. For the most part, it just makes you have to consider your movement more and is mostly fine. When it starts to become problematic is when it's comboed with the skulls. While he does have an attack that specifically spawns the skulls, he will also occasionally spawn them from some of his other attacks. When this is comboed with his lightning attack, the fight just kinda devolved into a bit of a shit show where I was just panic rolling instead of actually trying to time them with anything. This isn't really something that is rare, as it is a specific attack that he'll use pretty often. This being said, it's not as though everything about Phase 3 is bad. Overall, it's a very visually striking phase, with a lot of effects that look great. He also does not have a cutscene between these two phases, as he will just play a short animation in the fight that indicate the change. This last one will sound a bit negative, but at the very least, his third phase isn't all that long. Most of the fight will be spent in Phase 2, making it so the problems I have with the third phase aren't all that impactful in the overall fight. So, from a gameplay and presentation perspective, I think Gael is a pretty fantastic fight. Though I have to admit, I am a bit hesitant to talk about my biggest problem with Gael, as it doesn't really have anything to do with the fight itself. I also haven't really seen anyone else complain about this, but I still thought I would include it, as even with however biased of an opinion it is still my list after all. My main problem with Gael is Gael himself. Gael is supposed to be the final fight we ever get in the Dark Souls series. He is the grand finale. But compared to Soul of Cinder, I just find him a bit lacking. I don't mean in terms of his fight. Evidently from his placement, I think Gael is a much better fight. It's just that in a storytelling sense, Gael just ends up feeling a lot less impactful. He doesn't really have any overarching meaning to the series. Obviously he does end up leading you to the Pygmy Lords, which has a lot of lore significance, but Gael himself just doesn't mean much. He is a character that was introduced in Dark Souls 3, and even in this game you only end up meeting him a couple of times before you fight him. Emotionally, I just didn't care that I was fighting Gael. He could have been replaced with any number of people and my overall reaction would have been the same. Compare that to how I felt getting goosebumps when fighting the Soul of Cinder, and there really isn't any comparison between the two. Though to be fair, a lot of people would probably just refute this by saying that Soul of Cinder is still the last boss and Gael wasn't meant to replace him. Which is fair if that is your stance on it, but as someone who is playing this as current content, Gael is the final fight that you end up fighting, so I was still left with the impression that I have now. Again, this doesn't really have any effect on the fight directly, but my emotional attachment to the bosses is a pretty big part for me. If you haven't noticed from the past entries, the way the fight makes me feel is probably the most important part, even more important than the actual mechanics in some cases. I can honestly excuse a bullshit move if it at least looks radical. I have tried to balance it out throughout the video to try and at least be somewhat objective with my ratings, but that became hard to uphold when it came to the last entries on the list, so this is how it ended up. Overall, I still think Gael is a fantastic fight, and if only it had the same sort of impact on me that the Soul of Cinder did, it would probably end up being my favorite boss fight in any game I've played. Man, it's a bit awkward that I decided to pick Kos right after Gael, especially when I went on that way too long rant on how important it was to me that Gael was a bit of a no one. But the way I view Kos is pretty much the complete opposite of Gael. While I was disappointed that Gael was a lackluster conclusion to the series from a storytelling perspective, I like that Kos doesn't even try to be that lore significant. Obviously, he does have lore implications that is fairly important, but that is more that he exists at all, and not anything to do with his character. My favorite part of this fight is that it's just that, a fight. and most importantly, a really fucking hard one. Kos is like the last hurdle for the player, a final fight where you have to put in to use everything you have learned so far to be able to even stand a chance. Kos is a really hard boss that won't hold anything back while fighting you, allowing you to do the same. Instead of being burdened with having to work in some sort of character into the moveset, devs were free to just design a brutally difficult fight with no restrictions. The result was a fight that I would consider to be the hardest I have ever made, at least until the release of Elden Ring, and even then it's really hard to decide. I'm going to be honest, this is probably one of the fights where the game it is in is the most important. I've made it no secret that Bloodborne has my favourite combat out of any of the FromSoft games. Problem being, I didn't find any of the main game bosses to be all that challenging. There were a couple like Logarius and Gascoigne that took me a few tries my first time around, but even with them, I cleared them much faster than most of the hard fights in Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring. Though when the DLC came out, Bloodborne really felt complete, with my top 3 fights all being from it. Finally I had some fights where I really felt challenged, with both Ludwig and Lady Maria taking more tries than any of the fights in the main game. But where it really gets hard is with Kos. There isn't really anything specific to point to when explaining why Kos is so hard. He doesn't have any unique mechanics that are hard to deal with, nor does he have any specific attack that feels particularly hard to dodge. His moveset is just filled with moves that are generally hard to dodge from a combination of their speed and aggression. Even his aggression is something that explained in the lore, seeing how the dude was literally just born. So gameplay wise, I honestly don't have that much to say about Kos. His moveset is great, everything feeling fair while still being extremely challenging in both his phase 1 and 2. Kos is also a good example of a two-phase fight that does it well, with phase 1 easing into the second phase while still being challenging on its own. Phase 2 ends up feeling unique despite reusing several of the same moves as phase 1, making you still feel familiar with the fight with just enough moves to keep you on edge. One of the greatest strengths of Bloodborne is its presentation, and Kos is no exception. The fact that you're fighting what is essentially a newborn from some cosmic being is one of the most original and unique concepts for a fight I've seen in a game. This is perfectly carried on in the gameplay, with this lore being reflected in the animations and attacks. Design-wise, I'm also a huge fan, but here I'm more biased than normal in the fact that I'm a sucker for Lovecraftian stories and designs. He is for the most part pretty basic design-wise, but this is honestly fine when considering the type of fight it is. I don't really have that much more to say about Kos. Boiled down, the main reason I rate this fight so high is because it's by far the hardest fight in Bloodborne, while still managing to feel completely fair. While I think it's to its advantage that it's simple, if it did have stronger lore implications with a more complex design, it would have the potential to be my favourite fight of all time. Though I am perfectly happy with the end result of what they made, and Kos does still end up being my third favourite fight.
I am Malenia, Blade of Mikola. And I have never known defeat.
Choosing between the final fight was probably the hardest choice I had to make in this entire list. Malenia ends up having a better presentation with more lore significance and a better flow in combat, but still has a few problematic attacks. Meanwhile, Friede ends up lacking when it comes to the presence in the series, but makes up for it with a fight that has 3 phases that all feel unique from one another, while still managing to make them all perfect. In the end, I ended up favouring the consistency of Friede's gameplay over Malenia's presentation. But enough about Friede, this is Malenia's segment after all. Despite only being the first of 2 phases, I think phase 1 of Malenia's fight managed to be the most enjoyable fight in the entire game. Phase 1 is another great example of what I like to call a duel fight. There isn't anything extra, there's a straight up one-on-one fight where both use whatever weapon they came equipped with. Though Malenia does have her lifesteal mechanic, but I don't personally find this to affect the actual duel feeling of the fight. All of her attacks in the phase are fun attacks to play against, giving the fight a great flow overall. Well, this is except for one attack. The waterfowl dance is a pretty controversial attack, many thinking it's a complete bullshit attack that is impossible to dodge, and honestly, usually I think I would agree with this. But for some reason, I don't really mind this attack all that much. For the most part, I don't like it when I have to use one specific thing from outside the fight to be able to clear it. And of course, you don't technically need to do this with this fight either. There are ways to dodge the attack with some clever movement, but I think the conclusion most people come to is that it's unreasonable to expect the player to do this. Again, I would normally agree with this, but the main reason I don't in this instance is that there are several in-game ways of either just straight up cancelling it or dodging it. But even not counting this, I still kind of like this sort of mechanic. This is the first time in a very long time they've introduced a mechanic where you can't just solve it by rolling. You actually have to think and use clever movement in a way to bait her into certain directions. I completely understand why people might not like this sort of mechanic, but Personally, I hope that FromSoft continues to do this sort of thing. It's innovative in a way that digs a bit deeper than letting you just jump over attacks. Moving on to the second phase. For the most part, despite phase 2 completely changing the way she fights, I find it to be pretty on par with phase 1 when it comes to general difficulty and enjoyment. It becomes less of a duel type fight and becomes more of a standard FromSoft fight where you're fighting a stronger being than yourself. What ends up being the saving grace for this phase for me is its presentation. Phase 2 Malenia is probably my favorite design that FromSoft has ever made. Visually, phase 2 Malenia is breathtaking. I pretty much immediately made up my mind once I saw it that Malenia was my favorite boss that they have made. She is fantastic in both visual design and storytelling. I only wish that she had slightly more lore around her. Hopefully they add a bit more in the DLC. Gameplay wise, I still really do like phase 2. It's just a bit hard to praise it when I do still think it's a downgrade from phase 1. It is more complex and has harder to dodge attacks, but it loses some of the flow I felt from the first phase. None of the attacks are problematic or bad, but it inherently just loses some of the flow as the attacks become more focused on her scarlet rot magic stuff rather than just her swordplay alone. I do still like that they did this phase though. It adds a lot to her character being shown her scarlet rot form, and even if I like it less, it's still a fantastic phase. I feel as though I should have more to say about Malenia, but honestly I don't. She's my favorite character in any FromSoft game, but I still really find it hard to express why other than she's just cool as hell. If you haven't looked into her lore, I would strongly recommend doing so. I won't be going through any of it here as this video is already way too long, but it is definitely worth reading. Well, I don't have much more to say, so I guess it's about time we moved on to my number 1 pick.
'Tis only the flame quivering at misguided ash. Please avert thine eyes. I will snuff out these ashes for good.
I have a lot to say about Friede, so I'm just going to go straight into phase 1. Sister Friede's first phase is pretty perfect when put in the context of the rest of the fight. Much like Isshin, it's a slow phase meant to ease you into the fight. All of her attacks, and even the way she moves, is very slow and meticulous. When considering how long the fight is, this makes perfect sense. It's the type of phase that after a few tries, you're just going to no-hit every time. Despite this, she does manage to be fairly unique, being one of the few bosses in the series that actually uses a stealth mechanic. I love this move for several reasons. Most obviously, it just looks really cool, both when she initially jumps away, but also when it connects. There aren't really all that many mechanics where you have to look at the dust the boss kicks up in order to determine her position. But most importantly, I love that it's a somewhat subtle callback to Priscilla. Friede took something that I thought was an interesting but underutilized mechanic from the Priscilla fight and built on that to make a mechanic that both looks amazing and is actually fun to play against. Topping it off that they are both fights in a painted world, and it's a pretty perfect highlight of the attention to detail that I love from FromSoft fights. So overall, I think phase 1 is pretty perfect as the first phase. It both eases you into the fight while also priming you for the rest of it. Aside from the gameplay, I'm still a pretty massive fan of everything else related to this fight. The intro cutscene is great and it's honestly pretty iconic. It had me quoting Father Ariandel for days afterwards. Both Father Ariandel and Sister Friede have memorable designs that are pretty distinct from the rest of the game, which does make sense when considering how the painted world is isolated from the rest of the world. The fact that it is isolated does end up being a bit of a double-edged sword though. It does a great job of making it feel unique, while also having some callbacks to the painted world in Dark Souls 1. Though this comes with a downside that it makes it very isolated from the rest of the game in a lore sense. On its own, the lore of the painted world is great. I love the lore of the world itself and how Ariandel fits into it, but when it comes to Friede specifically, I find it to be a bit weak. There is the fact that she is initially from Londo and has connection to some of the characters from there, but there isn't much more than this. She has the basis for something that could have ended up being very interesting, but instead you don't really get to learn that much about her from the DLC. This isn't really much of an aspect of the fight that I find bad, just disappointing and a missed opportunity. Moving on to the second phase, and the quality very much keeps up. The second phase is a duo fight against both Father Ariandel and Friede, and honestly, if you were to single this out as a single fight, it would probably be my second favorite duo fight in the entire series. It is basically what ONS could have been, a fight between a big and a small boss. While ONS had the problem of both the bosses being too aggressive, not really giving enough openings, this phase pretty much completely solves the problem by flipping the script and making Friede the passive one. Overall, Father Ariandel is pretty much the exact same as Mo. just much bigger and with a very different moveset, but he is still just some big dude that is pretty much constantly trying to run you down. But instead of having to also deal with the second enemy, Friede pretty much always keeps to the back and mostly uses ranged instead. This makes for a lot more of an enjoyable experience where you can mainly focus on hitting Ariandel, but still having to keep a Friede in mind. The way they achieve this is one of the most impressive design decisions in the entire game. Of course, you need to keep her in mind as she will attack you, but instead of making this attack an instant hit, it does thrust damage over time, making it less punishing to get hit by, but if you get hit too much, you will get debuffed and chunked. This is much preferable than it being an instant hit that does a lot of damage and staggers you, like most other duo fights tend to use. The downside to making her attacks damage over time is that you don't really need to see her at all, just react to her attacks when they come. The way to solve this is by giving Friede a healing move. While in most other fights this might end up being frustrating, in this fight it makes perfect sense. By giving her this mechanic, and by making it the only way you can tell that is happening by directly looking at her, it forces you to always keep an eye on Friede in the entire phase. This combined with Ariandel's moves all being very slow and easy to deal with, makes for a duo fight that is challenging, but fun and engaging the entire way through. This being said, I do have some problems with this phase, most coming from Father Ariandel. Like most other big bosses, Father Ariandel ends up having some hitbox problems. Most of the attacks consist of rushing attacks where he just kinda runs, or well I guess crawls at you. The problem comes when the attack starts and when it ends. Much like Dragon Rush attacks, it's way too easy to get hit before you can really tell an attack has started, or get hit when they seem that the attack has ended but it still has a damaging hitbox around the boss. Other than this, I don't really have any problems with this phase. The end of this phase is pretty genius and one of the best fake outs that FromSoft has done. The dialogue, plus giving you a slab, really gives you the sense that you've cleared the fight, and then the fear that you feel as Friede stands back up and activates yet another power is pretty unrivaled. Giving you the slab was especially clever as it doubles as both a fake out and is actually really convenient for players that might struggle with the next phase, as it allows you to either fully upgrade your current weapon or swap to another weapon that is better suited for this specific fight. Despite phase 1 and 2 already being some of my favorite individual phases in the series, phase 3 is where it really pops off. This is where phase 1 really gets to show how good it actually is, but being a pretty good way of priming you for phase 3. They share a lot of attacks, though phase 3 obviously adds a lot more to it. In most fights, you'd expect the boss having 3 different elements would end up being too much, but Friede balances between them pretty perfectly. She never ends up spamming one too much and uses a good even spread. If anything, this spread ends up being a bit too perfect, as I wouldn't mind her using a Black Flame moves a bit more as they are new. Despite having both Frost and Black Flame attacks, Friede still manages to achieve a pretty great flow to her fight. A lot of bosses with elemental attacks ends up feeling too segmented, like it's just a mix of single attacks that the boss throws at you, but with Friede's physical attacks she manages to use a mix and achieves a pretty fantastic flow that is fun to play against while never really feeling unfair. This being said, I do think she has one attack that I think might be a bit problematic, but in classic Souls fans fashion, I'm going to argue that it's actually really clever game design. The attack in question is the one where she jumps into the air and shoots a Black Flame wheel at you. Where a lot of people might find a problem with this attack is that you cannot dodge straight into it like you can with basically every other attack in the entire game. At first glance I agreed with this, but having thought about it, I think this is actually pretty clever. You see, the start animation of this attack can actually result in 2 different attacks, one being the Black Flame wheel and the second one being a Frost attack. You can very easily tell which she's going to do by the effects around her, but the actual animation is the same. The reason I find this to be pretty significant is that while you can't roll through the Black Flame version, you can with the Frost version, making so you actually have to see the effect on her and act accordingly. This is pretty rare in FromSoft fight, as you can for the most part just deal with every attack the same way, but here you actually have to think and act accordingly. I wish FromSoft would do more attacks like this, but as far as I can remember, they didn't end up doing this for Elden Ring, which is a shame. Other than this, I think her moveset is pretty perfect. The third phase alone is one of my favorite one-on-one fights in the entire series, with Malenia probably being the only one that actually manages to top it. And of course, the visuals for this phase are also perfect. Continuing with the feeling of isolation, Friede is one of the few enemies in the entire game that actually uses Black Flame attacks. All of her attacks, plus the aura she gets, are all stunning, making her look unique and easily being one of my favorite soul bosses design-wise. If I were to force myself to critique the fight, it would probably be that it's a bit too easy. I think this is a pretty poor complaint, as for most people this fight will be perfectly tuned, but as someone who has spent way too much time on these games, the fight just isn't hard enough. Don't get me wrong, the fight is really hard, but when compared to harder fights like Malenia, Friede just doesn't manage to stack out. Like, for example, when I fought her when I was replaying all the games for this video, I ended up swapping weapons twice to make the fight harder. First, I start from a plus 10 refined exiled greatsword to a plus 5 wolf knight greatsword. This still ended up being a bit too much damage, so I swapped to a plus 6 refined Murakumo, which still did a bit too much damage, but it was the least damaging weapon I had, and I didn't want to go and get something else, so I ended up using it. Obviously, none of this is really fair to Friede, as I have fought her before, and also played more FromSoft stuff since fighting her. The first time I fought her, she was really challenging, and was probably the most challenging fight they had made up until that point. I do remember absolutely loving the fight after having fought it the first time, something that did end up affecting its placement on my list. Like I said before, my personal belief is that the first time you fight a boss is the most important, and therefore I give it more weight than any other time I fight a boss. Overall, the most impressive part of Friede is how she manages to be a fight with 3 phases, where every phase on its own is a top tier fight. She's one of the longest fights they've made, and is still the most consistent fight they've ever made. I still find it hilarious how at the time of release, phase 2 was my favorite duo fight that I've ever made, despite it being a single phase in a 3-phase fight. I remember being overall disappointed with the DLC as I was going through it, but after having beaten the fight, I thought it was honestly worth buying the DLC for this fight alone. And there you go, almost every single fight FromSoft has made since Dark Souls 1. Like previous videos, I'm just gonna do this one off the cuff and just kind of talk for a bit. Seeing how it's the last one, I don't really have anything interesting to say. Mostly just wrapping up and giving a couple of thoughts, I suppose. First off, I wanted to talk about just general stats. Seeing how it was a long series, and it was actually just shy of 200 minutes, so a bit over 3 hours long. The entire script was actually 50,000 words in total for every tier and the intros and outros and whatever, and was 144 bosses in total. So it was quite a bit. After this, I'll probably do like a super cut or like a mega cut, whatever you want to call it, of every tier, which, like I said, will be a bit over 3 hours long. I'll try and do some minor editing, make it fit, take out the intros and outros probably. And maybe make like a intro between the tiers that is purely visual, not like an actual talking intro bit to make it flow a bit better. Other than that, I don't really have any plans for what I want to make next. It probably will not be Souls related, and I'll probably try and make a more casual essay style video, kind of like I did with the WoW one. Though I will be making an update to the tier list when the DLC drops, and maybe eventually when I do actually get to play Demon Souls. They just kind of have to port it to PC first because I'm not getting a PS5. There was also a couple of bosses that I missed from Sekiro mainly. I'll probably try and throw those in, either into the DLC or the Demon Souls video as like a quick thing, but I'm not too bothered about it. But yeah, other than that, I don't really have much to say. I'm kind of glad I'm done with this series now. I've been working on this since September of 2022, so it's been quite a while, though obviously not constantly working on it. But yeah, just want to say thank you to everyone who's been watching since the very start, even though there's probably not a whole lot of you. Thank you to everyone who's watching just this video for that matter, and I hope you look forward to whatever I do end up making next, and hopefully it won't take many months. So thank you for watching, I see you next one.